Rikers Island is the product of policy decisions that have treated poverty, addiction, and mental illness as problems that is to be punished rather than to be supported. In neighborhoods across New York City, these policies show up as over policing, chronic disinvestment, and the criminalization of survival. The Close Rikers movement emerged to confront these failures and to demand a different approach to public safety. To understand why closing Rikers became a political demand, we have to look at how the movement began. The Close Rikers movement launched in 2016 as a community led response to decades of abuse, racialized violence, and preventable deaths. For over 150 years, Rikers has harmed Black, Brown, and low income New Yorkers through brutality and systemic neglect. The movement reframes Rikers as a policy failure, and it argues that Rikers is not broken, but it is functioning exactly as it's designed. Activists also argue that the harm is structural and that the only ethical response is to close Rikers Island, not to reform it. Activists highlight the story of Khalif Browder and names it as the catalyst for this movement. In 2010, Khalif Browder was 16 years old when he was accused of stealing a backpack and was sent to Rikers Island. Because his family was unable to afford his bail amount of $3,000, Khalif was subjected to spend 3 years at Rikers Island with over 400 days spent in solitary confinement before his release in 2013. Though Khalif survived Rikers Island, the trauma he endured had followed him home, and in 2015, Khalif died by suicide at the age of 22. His story turned public grief into organized political action and became the moral foundation of the closed record movement, which later demanded structural change throughout Rikers Island. The movement aims to shift society away from punitive justice towards community based intervention. The movement calls for the permanent closure of Rikers Island, the reduction of jail populations, the redirection of fundings to community services such as housing, mental health, education, and community based safety programs. It also calls us to challenge the belief that punishment equals safety and insists that safety comes from care, stability, and resources. It also asks us to highlight survival testimonies, to shift public opinions, and to reframe incarceration as a human rights crisis. These testimonies are important as it exposes the deeper structures that feed people into Rikers Island. The pipeline into Rikers is built from policy decisions such as racialized policing, broken window enforcement, cash bail, and a chronic disinvestment in low income communities throughout New York City. Mental health and substance use systems may also fail to provide sufficient care, which pushes people into crisis driven police encounters. Additional factors such as housing instability, court delays, parole violations, and a lack of sufficient resources may also widen the pipeline that makes an individual more susceptible to imprisonment. These are both explicit and implicit policies that criminalize poverty and creates a pattern of imprisonment. The pattern of imprisonment includes a minor offense, often something rooted in poverty like fare evasion or a low level possession, which triggers an arrest. Then, an unaffordable bail amount is set, which means the person cannot buy their freedom and is held in pre-trial detention. Detention then harms stability, and people are often losing housing, custody, jobs, and access to treatment or medication while in detention. They are then released into deeper levels of poverty, which leaves the person with fewer resources than before, making survival even harder. This then makes rearrest for survival behaviors more likely because the underlying needs were never addressed. In the field of social work, we often work with clients or communities that have been affected by the pattern of imprisonment. I recently worked with a client by the name of Yvette who has had a long history of homelessness and substance use, often selling small quantities of marijuana to survive. In 2012, she was arrested for jumping a turnstile, and she spent 8 months at Rikers Island until her family could afford her bail amount. During detention, Yvette's daughter's paternal grandparents obtained emergency custody and she was unable to regain it. The trauma deepened her addiction, destabilized her mental health, and led to housing loss. While she currently resides in supported housing, her placement is in a high drug use area, which further feeds her addiction and heightens her chance of rearrest for survival behaviors. When we look at the forces that drive people into Rikers through an ecological lens, we see a system operating across multiple levels. At the micro level, individuals navigate daily stressors, trauma, and unmet needs. At the meso level, neighborhood and community environments, including local services, shelters, and public benefit systems, shape access to support or the lack of it. At the exo level, the New York City criminal legal system, street level policing, and healthcare access determine who is targeted, who is protected, and who is abandoned. At the macro level, racialized policing, structural disinvestment, and dominant beliefs about safety reinforce punishment over care. And across the chrono system, generational poverty, historical policing patterns, and intergenerational incarceration deepen vulnerability over time. These layers don't just shape risk, they shape the condition inside Rikers itself, where policy failure becomes a matter of life or death. Personal stories highlighted in the Close Rikers movement are used to reframe the narrative around imprisonment. Activists use experiences that are typically dismissed as individual mistakes and reveal them to be outcomes of structural racism and poverty criminalizations. Testimonies are used to politicize what the city has treated as personal failures and expose how minor offenses can unravel entire lives. However, institutions tell a different story. In the depoliticized framing, structural harm gets reduced to noncompliance, relapse, or poor decision making. Media coverage isolates incidents instead of naming the policies that produce them, and bureaucratic language sanitize violence and erase the political nature of what leads to imprisonment. The gap between structural reality and institutional denial creates the ethical dilemmas that social workers face when working inside the criminal legal system. Social workers navigating the carceral systems face profound ethical tensions. We are asked to provide services inside institutions that harm our clients. We may be pressured to prioritize institutional risk over human dignity, and we must maintain integrity even when the system around us continues to violate human rights. The Close Rikers movement challenges us to align our practice with justice, not compliance, and to advocate for policies that prevent harm rather than manage it after the fact. But even when people want to fight for justice, there continue to be barriers to collective action. Those who are directly impacted by the criminal legal system face several barriers to participating in policy reform. These barriers include fear of retaliation from the Department of Correction or judges, parole restrictions that limit political activity, and they may experience housing instability, unemployment, and trauma that make organizing a luxury. As for social workers, our barriers may include nonprofit funding structures that discourage bold advocacy, institutional surveillance, and fear of losing employment. Despite these obstacles, activists continue to push the movement forward. The Closed Rikers movement used a multi layer strategy which included direct action, story based advocacy, policy lobbying, litigation, coalition building, and narrative change. These tactics were used to shift public perception from the idea that Rikers needed to be reformed to Rikers must close. By centering survivor voices, the movement transformed individual story into political demands, and these strategies have produced real measurable wins. In 2019, the City Council committed to closing Rikers by 2027. The city also pledged to reduce overall jail capacity by 75% and to lower the jail population by more than 3,300 people. These outcomes demonstrate that significant policy change is achievable when directly impacted communities lead collective action. However, the movement also encounters substantial limitations. The movement runs into pushback, deeply rooted carceral thinking, and slow movement government processes. Some officials say they support closing Rikers, but simultaneously expand other forms of surveillance and control. There are also growing tensions between groups that are focused on reform and those who are pushing for full abolition. Abolitionist organizers oppose the city's plan to build 4 new borough based jails. They argue that replacing one jail with 4 smaller jails does not end incarceration and it simply relocates it. They also argue that the $8.4 billion allocated for construction could instead be used to fund housing, mental health care, youth programs, and community infrastructures. The Closed Rikers movement challenges social workers to return to its core values. It asks us to recognize that the systems we work within are not neutral and that they actively produce harm. An abolitionist policy lens urges social workers to follow the leadership of directly impacted people, to document patterns of structural harm, and to bring those truths into policy. It calls on us to advocate for non carceral, community based alternatives and to challenge policies rooted in surveillance, punishment, or forced compliance. Most importantly, it requires shifting from a model focused on fixing individuals to one centered on repairing systems and addressing the structural conditions that create the harm in the first place. As an alternative, I recommend the creation of community governed crisis and harm response centers that are staffed by peers, clinicians, mediators, and social workers rather than police officers. These centers will respond to mental health crisis, substance use, conflict, and survival based behaviors with care instead of punishment. They would offer housing navigation, detox support, food, medical care, and restorative mediation to divert people away from arrest, arraignment, and pretrial detention. This model can help to reflect the deeper truth that public safety is created through stability, care, and community rather than incarceration. It aligns with social work's core values and it helps to move us towards a future where our systems repair harm rather than reproduce it. The story of Rikers showed that incarceration is not an individual failure, but it is the outcome of policy decisions that criminalize poverty. The Close Rikers movement demonstrates that abolition is both necessary and possible. It calls on us as social workers and policy practitioners to align with the communities most harmed by these systems and to fight for policies that create safety through care, stability, and dignity. Thank you for engaging with this analysis, and I welcome your questions and your reflections.